It's a real pleasure to be here with you. When Pat contacted me and said, would you be willing to come and share some of your thoughts and reflections on sort of the state of the movement? And she described who all was going to be here. And I said, you know, I've had these health challenges in recent years, and I've had to say no to so many of you to get into your communities. And I said, you mean they're all going to be in one place at one time? So here's at least my chance to come and say, I'm sorry I couldn't get to some of you. It's good to be with old friends always, and good friends in recovery and friends of recovery. It's good to meet some of you finally who've been doing email exchanges for seems like centuries and finally get to put faces on those. So it's a pleasure to be here. They've passed out a very detailed outline that I'm not going to go through. It's typical of one of my character defects. If somebody says, will you give us a few points, that I write a dissertation, so I apologize a bit for that. I'm obviously not going to go through that whole outline, but I am going to highlight some things, and I did want you to have some of the more detailed points, and I will be converting that into a paper, surprise, surprise, that I'll make sure we get out to all of you and that you're welcome to disseminate in any way you would choose at that point. I want to begin by reflecting a little bit about where we've come as a movement in terms of our achievements. Hey, John. Hey. And in retrospect, looking back on those early days, and I'm really talking about the 1997-98 to the 2004 and 5, when much of the infrastructure of this movement came together. What were some of the things that we got right? But let me say, before I get into those details, that I didn't think I would see this day in my lifetime when I would be standing in front of directors of recovery community organizations throughout the United States that were not addiction treatment programs and not recovery mutual aid societies, but a culturally and politically mobilized recovery community. When I entered treatment and entered recovery in 1969 and entered the field a few weeks later, which you could do at that time, by the way, because there wasn't a long line of people wanting to do this work. If somebody would have told me as I went through these stench-filled back wards of aging state psychiatric hospitals and the alcoholism wards, and I was an outreach worker in those days and visiting people addicted and dying in jail cells, for God's sakes, because there were virtually no treatment resources. If somebody would have said, Bill, don't despair, because in your lifetime, you will not only see treatment organizations in every major community in this country, you will see recovery community organizations in those communities. Don't despair, because in your lifetime, you're going to see a First Lady of the United States on national television talking about her recovery from alcoholism and drug dependence. If somebody would have said, in your lifetime, you're going to watch and see more than 100,000 people marching in recovery celebration events, public recovery celebration events around the country, and you're going to stand on hilltops and see recovering people as far as the eyes can see? Impossible, impossible to conceive that that could have happened in my lifetime. And here we are. And we just lived that this last September, right? So, okay, what did we get right? I think as our movement came together in the late 1990s, and it crystallized in the 2001 summit in St. Paul, we did get some things right in retrospect. Some by luck, some by pluck, and some just out of early painful experiences and being candid with one another and honest about what was working and what wasn't working. One of those was we brought some recovery values that have served us very well into that early process. And those values were humility, which meant we paid honor to those people who'd gone before us in terms of things like SOAR and all the early work of Marty Mann and NCADD and all the recovery advocacy efforts that came before us. We did not come in with arrogance, saying we were going to bury that past. We virtually expressed our profound appreciation for those efforts and in many ways accepted the torch that they passed to us. We were very fortunate in escaping some of the hazards of any social movement, which is the hazard of centralized charismatic leadership. We got it right. When people came around asking us, who are your leaders of this movement you're writing about? We said either we don't have any leaders or we're all leaders. And we avoided that single charismatic figure that so many movements have imploded behind when those leaders eventually self-destructed. And we got that right, and we continue to get that right with the grassroots effort. What Faces and Voices did that we so desperately needed, we didn't need a charismatic leader, we needed connective tissue. And Pat and her staff from the very beginning has provided that tissue right up until today. Cultural and recovery pathway diversity was from our very beginnings. The movements that preceded us were overwhelmingly white and they were overwhelmingly male. And we had this vision of a rainbow. We had this vision of an ecumenical movement. We talked about a coat of many colors. And in those earliest days, we had a coat of many colors. Not only in terms of the cultural and gender diversity and LGBT involvement, but we represented an incredible diverse array of recovery pathways. For the first time, we suggested that people who were AA and NA members would be walking side by side with people and women for sobriety and secular organization for sobriety. And God forbid people in medication-assisted treatment and recovery. Okay, and we did that, and in retrospect, we got that right, and it was crucial to everything that has come since. We organized this movement. And it's not like we created the ideas ahead of time, but in this outline in front of you, you'll see 5 kinetic ideas that came together in 1998, 99, 2000. The first of which was simply, this is a movement not about the pathology of addiction. We're not here to stand up and talk about one more lecture on the evils of demon rum or drug addiction. It's not a movement about addiction treatment. It is a movement about the lived solution to these problems. That was critical to everything that has flowed since. We said there are multiple pathways to recovery, and most importantly, all are cause for celebration. Those first 2 of the 5 that are outlined there were critical to the mobilization efforts that quickly began to unfold in those years. We developed and sort of said, well, what is this move? We're going to mobilize people for what? To do what? And we outlined 8 strategies that I've listed on that paper that I wrote about first, I think, around 2000. And what surprises me today in retrospect was how well those 8 strategies have weathered in community after community around the United States. And what surprises me even more is how well they are weathering as they're getting transplanted internationally around the world. The other thing that we did was we created a network of recovery community organizations, a supportive network that allowed us to come together, share our lessons, share what we were learning, build skills with one another, mutually support one another, all behind the idea that this effort is incredibly important. But nothing is more important than the primacy of our personal recovery as a foundation for everything we do. And that idea continues to today. With that, I could spend hours talking about everything I got right. I could spend hours talking about some of the incredible concrete achievements that have flown out of this movement. I want to, because of limited time, talk maybe in a little more detail about some of the threats in the future. I think we continue to face what I think is sort of a triple threat to the movement, sort of the essence of the movement or the heart of the movement. And those are the threat of colonization, and that is that we as a movement get hijacked by forces more powerful in our operating environment. That's always a risk. My early concerns was and continues to be that we not simply become an extension or a loose appendage to the addiction treatment system in the United States. If all this movement does and we all transform ourselves into a post-treatment recovery support system for addiction treatment in the United States, this movement will have failed. And it will set the seeds for what will be the need for a new movement 10 years from today who will try to rebirth our original version. The threat of professionalization that all of you are encountering as we get into credentialing experiences with peer-based recovery support services. We could replicate the modern history of addiction counseling, and pretty soon a recovery coach will need 2 master's degrees and 4 or 5 years of supervision before they're able to enter that role. We also have the threat of commercialization. I am acutely concerned about this one. And that is, there's a long history of harm in the name of help in the history of addiction treatment. And I'm very concerned with the very best of intentions. If we over-commercialize, maybe even commercialize, recovery support services within a community, what happens to that indigenous service ethic within local communities of recovery? Pretty soon, does everybody want to get paid to sponsor somebody? If that day arrives, it will be a disaster for this movement. We must continue to elevate the role of volunteerism and the service ethic that comes out of that, and not overly commercialize this particular support role. I'm worried that we could be marginalized in the growing flurry of service integration initiatives, health reform initiatives. I think it's we're such a small part of this, but it's critical that we be at the table and bring recovery as an agenda into those. Or this system will take off and move, and we will find ourselves in some kind of marginalized, encapsulated appendage so distant that we'll have no influence on the majority of people with these problems. The issue of, I want to give you, I don't have time to do this. I want to show you what marginalization can do in terms of things like service integration. And the SAMHSA recovery definition, at least one of the Lord knows how many iterations at this point, but if we have a recovery definition comes out that has not one reference to a fundamental change in somebody's relationship with alcohol and drugs, how are we doing with that recovery definition? Okay, I'm saying that is basically death by dilution. And we must fight to maintain the integrity of some of these core ideas related to the recovery experience and process. We have issues related to leadership development and succession planning. If you haven't noticed, there are a few of us getting a little long in the tooth. So part of the concern gets to be is who begins to take over in all of your communities. And I'm not just talking age now, I'm talking life expectancy, given the intensity of some of these roles. Agreed? Because some of you feel a whole lot older than you look right now from this work. I don't want to bring that up to you too much, but so the question gets to be, we have to constantly be involved in leadership development and succession planning within our key organizations and key subcommittees and virtually at all levels. Let me talk a little bit about, I think the one final threat that I want to mention is really the threat of what I predict is a coming backlash against the movement that we have started now for these many years. There's never been a successful social movement in history that hasn't experienced a backlash. Are you with me? Women's movement, backlash. Civil rights movement, backlash, and on and on and on. We will experience that backlash. Part of that backlash will come from some interesting places. I believe it will come from the media, because the very people who we finally got to do some coverage and elevate some of our recovery heroes, the second a recovery hero falls, I promise you, the intensity of media coverage will be 10 times what the initial coverage of the recovery hero's role was. Secondly will be the addiction treatment industry that is looking at us quite closely, and some of them extremely excited about what we're doing and partnering with us in amazingly effective ways. They get it. And then we have some other folks that really worry about us. Because you know what? If we really build the kind of recovery support systems at a community level, indigenous, non-professional, non-commercialized support, what do you think will happen to census when all those people who've been admitted for their 5th and 6th and 7th time start disappearing because they're in recovery in the community? Part of what we're about is we will pose some significant threats to some part of the treatment industry. So make no bones about it. These are powerful institutional interests. And if you think those interests aren't powerful enough, what do you think about the alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceutical industries? And the criminal justice system potentially is part of that. So the point gets to be is there are some powerful forces out there, and we need to monitor their activities pretty carefully for our own self-protection. And there's some things we need to be doing by way of the way we're handling our fiduciary responsibilities with money needs to be impeccable. Agreed? Yes. Our books need to be squeaky clean. Number two. We need ethical guidelines and standards related to peer-based recovery support services wherever we are implementing them. Because if we don't, it is a psychopath's dream. Are you okay with me on this? Lots of vulnerable people, no boundaries. Yes, I'll sign up for that, as the psychopath says. And I think number three is that we need to, I don't know how do I say this? We need to find ways to support our leaders at all levels and make them acutely aware of the impact of their personal conduct and how that personal conduct can ripple in dramatic ways to affect this movement in local recovery community organizations. Our message is only as effective and only as credible as our messengers. And when we have some of those falls for grace, from grace, we need to do everything we can to prevent them, and on occasion they're going to happen, agreed? And when they happen, we cannot turn our backs on those individuals. As anyone else, we need to be there for them when that occurs, and most importantly, we need to be there with them before it occurs. With me? Okay, we need to prepare for that backlash. I want to talk about kind of at a systems level where we're at in terms of the stages of the movement and kind of where I see us. I think we're going to have to, as the movement goes forward, continually do recovery representation checks. And what I mean is the adequacy of that representation at multiple levels, agreed, within each state's community, the authenticity of that representation, and avoid problems of double agentry. Everybody with me? Meaning that we have people who represent themselves as a person representing the recovery community or a recovery community, when in fact they bring with them hidden institutional interest that begin to influence what comes out of their mouth as an advocate. I'm not saying we shouldn't have people in treatment who are also serving as advocates, but we got to be very, very careful. If all of our advocates that are visible and vocal also represent the treatment industry, how are we doing here? Because we got issues far, far broader and of greater concern than the treatment industry in the United States at this point. I think we're at a stage that I'm very excited about because there's no precedent for this in history. Historically, recovery support in the United States has been recovery mutual aid on one side and addiction treatment on the other side for 250 years. And guess what? We got growth of recovery community organizations, recovery schools, recovery homes, recovery industries, recovery cafes. What is this? This is institution building that goes from a stage of mobilization of people to building institutional infrastructure that can sustain change for prolonged periods of time from this movement. We need to continue to build and strengthen those infrastructures. We'll see them continue to expand in the United States. And as we do that, build an ecumenical culture of recovery in the United States. Everybody with me? Ecumenical. Not a 12-step, not secular, not spiritual, not religious per se. Ecumenical, meaning what? All of us, that there is a culture of recovery, that people who share the status of recovery come together and share some common values and common language and music and symbols and rituals and on and on and on. Part of that development, I think, was going to be our next stage, and that's economic development. We have a large number of people we represent who have been marginalized from this culture, agreed? We have a large percentage who've been sequestered from this culture in an ever-growing multi-zillion-dollar prison industry in this country. And our people feed that system. They're the raw materials that the profits in that system are based upon. So the question gets to be, if we're going to extract people from that system, how do we begin to support people who have such incredible difficulties getting back into the mainstream economy? And my suggestion to us, it is now time for us to build our own economy. And I want you to have a vision of recovery community organizations beginning to serve as incubators for micro businesses organized by and for people in recovery. I think a next wave is going to be, we've done an incredible job of mobilizing, but every time you mobilize as quickly as we have done, we need to look around and say, hey, who got left out? Who did we not bring to the table? And I want to make a couple of suggestions to you. African American and Native American communities were at the heart of the beginning of this movement. Whether we're talking about the Wellbriety movement and everything that Don Coas and White Bryson brought, to the communities of Atlanta and Detroit and Washington, D.C. and Baltimore and on and on. My question to you is, where are the Asian communities? Okay, where are the Hispanic communities? And my point with this is, we have not yet fully mobilized in those communities of color. And you know what? It's time we reached out and began to take that next step with those communities. Young people in recovery, I could not be more excited. We have the first and largest generation of young people in recovery in history. And if they are advocates, some of us, by the time we got the advocacy thing put together, our life expectancy are pretty short at that point. But imagine if all of us would have entered this world when we were 25 to 30. And imagine the years of skill development and sophistication we would build around that. We need to recruit those young people in recovery, support them, and build the next generation of leaders who will follow us. Retirees in recovery, I'm very pleased to talk about this one. We have also the largest generation of older people in this culture in recovery in history. And with ever increasing life expectancies, and some of us done pretty good in recovery, so we got a few financial resources to boot. What kind of resources do you think we could bring to bear if every person in recovery over 60 years of age in this country was tapped and brought into the recovery advocacy and support movement as volunteers and advocates and staff and such things? Impressive. Grieving families. We bring the families to the table who've been impacted by addiction, right? We bring the families from treatment. We bring our recovering families together. But there's some missing people at the table. What about all those families whose child didn't get the blessings of recovery because they died first? And you know what? We got some grieving, angry parents, including angry parents that have spent, incomprehensible amounts of money on multiple rehab stays. And what they have to show for that is a kid buried in the ground. Now, you want to talk about an advocate? When somebody comes up in their faith and sings treatment works? My point is, we need them, but even more so, they need us. Are you with me? We need to begin to extend the whole notion of recovery supports into that population and to invite them into the advocacy roles within our organizations. Finally, I really want to talk about the population of people seeking and who need to seek recovery inside the criminal justice system in the United States. This is the largest population of incarcerated people with alcohol and drug problems in history in this country. My prediction is we will see a vibrant, highly politicized recovery advocacy movement emerging from the heart of the prison system within the next decade. And you know what? We need to be there with a hand reaching out to offer our support for that movement when it arises. What are the next kinetic ideas? I want to suggest first that what we don't know about recovery is killing people. Pat and myself, a bunch of us, been on our knees begging NIH to give up their goddamn brain slides, okay? And begin to focus on something that makes a difference in people's lives in terms of recovery, initiation, and maintenance. And we've struggled to get them to sort of get it, to be perfectly blunt. And what I'm suggesting is I'm tired. And I think it's time we gave up our passivity and begging them, and I think it's time we became much more confrontive in our approach and basically said, there are critical questions individuals and families in recovery are facing. We need answers to their questions. We are citizens, we are paying taxes, and we want those dollars to go to answering those questions. The idea that recovery is contagious is, to me, I think, one of the most important ideas of the past century. Because before, everybody said, you know what, you know the mantra, nobody gets into recovery until they're ready, they hit bottom, and all that nonsense. Well, you all know that's bullshit, because some of you in this room, you didn't choose recovery. Recovery came and claimed your butt, okay? I mean, you got caught up in it, just like you got caught up in addiction. Now, you may have chosen it later, but you didn't choose it when you initiated recovery, and that's the lesson out of this movement. John can go into the jails and make recovery contagious in some of the most despicable environments in the world. And people catch it in spite of themselves, for God's sakes. Now, if we know that, what that suggests to us, part of our goal is to increase what I'm calling recovery carriers, people who make recovery infectious. With me? And what we need to do is increase the density of recovery carriers in every community in the United States. And not wait for people to come get it, for people to come to treatment, but what? We're going to go get them. And if they're out there going crazy like so many of us did, we're going to say, hang on, because we're coming. Okay? The idea of community recovery, the idea that, well, first the idea of community recovery capital. When people go to treatment multiple times and fail, we say to them, they had their chance. And they get divorced, they get sent to jail, they get their babies taken, and on. They said they had their chance, they blew it. I'm arguing that we are putting people in systems of intervention and support so brief, so lacking in intensity, so lacking in quality, that some of those individuals, given the severity of their problems and the low recovery capital, have no chance of recovery. And when they fail, it is not a personal failure, it is a systems failure. Are you with me? And I'm saying with that the prognosis for personal and family recovery is predicted every bit as much by community recovery capital as it is by personal recovery capital. And if that's a personal failure, it's a community failure. And the community has a responsibility over time to begin to systematically increase community capital within it. On top of that, we know some communities have been so injured for so long by alcohol and drug problems and all the problems that go with them, that the community itself has been so deeply wounded, it needs recovery. With me? That the community itself needs a recovery process. And what I'm suggesting is we as people in recovery have an opportunity to become the catalyst of healing at that kind of community level. Frontier issues for us. I want to suggest that there's sort of a third leg of our movement that is emerging, I think. The level of advocacy that we began with, the peer recovery support services that we then bridged to. And I think the third next emerging area is the issue of family and community service. Everybody with me? The first of those issues were really about us and what we needed for our mutual support. And I'm really suggesting that part of the image of the movement and changing the stigma of the movement will involve shifting from moving publicly from a rights focus. That advocacy work, I promise, will continue. But we move from a rights movement to a responsibility movement. That we are taking responsibility, and part of the amends we're making is not only to our individuals, not only to our families, we're making amends to our communities. And we do that through the vehicle of extended family and community service. I want to talk about the role of families a little bit. I think a huge issue we haven't touched yet is how do we break intergenerational cycles of addiction and related problems. I think that is our ultimate issue, because how many, as we really begin to listen to people in recovery, who finally get recovery stabilized only to look around and confront the same problem in their children and grandchildren and siblings or parents. My point is, we're going to reach a point of consciousness. We're going to kind of wake up one day and say, it's not enough just to help an individual in recovery and to help that family heal around that. What do we do to break these ungodly powers that seem to be driving alcohol and drug-related problems from generation to generation? That's a big agenda, and I think we need to embrace it. I think the image of our movement needs to move from individuals in recovery to families in recovery. I think we need to increasingly bring children into this movement. What do you think it meant for the civil rights movement the moment children began to march on the streets of the South? What did it mean for the LGBT rights movement when we suddenly saw gay and lesbian couples with their children and see them as family units? I'm really suggesting, as we think about image, right? Faces. I'm suggesting the faces as we move forward need to be increasingly surrounded by families and need to include the children that are so precious to so many of us. I want to mention one other thing quickly, and that is we've worked so hard to get people in recovery and to build supports to sustain that recovery. We just had a very troubling survey finished up in Philadelphia. We looked at Philadelphia and the surrounding counties. What we found was a great recovery prevalence rate. We wanted to do somersaults when we saw this data. And then we looked at the data of the health profile of people in recovery. And what do you think we found? What we know from our personal lives is people in recovery bring incredible baggage with them out of the addiction process. And some of that is devastating on their long-term health, around life expectancy and quality of life. And I would be remiss if I did not suggest that a number of those are related to the fact that we continually, every day, have people standing up around the country talking about the joys of drug-free living while chain-smoking cigarettes that are killing them while they're sucking on their oxygen tanks. There's a point in this movement when we must confront the issue of nicotine addiction. As an addiction, we must begin to define where does abstinence from nicotine addiction fit into this concept of recovery. Let me just close very quickly, just because I'm very near out of time. So these are some pretty big agendas that we've got before us that I've tried to outline for you. And one of the critical questions, very close to my heart, is how do we do this work we've been involved in, and how do we sustain that over time and stay sane and stay healthy? I'm very serious. This is not easy stuff, agreed? Because there are times like me, you're going to get hate mail from both ends of the continuum on the same day, okay? I mean, we get a lot of bennies for what we do, and we catch a lot of shit for what we do as well, right? And it gets to be, you know, some days you say, why am I doing this? You know, have I got some kind of masochism streak going here? So I've looked very carefully. What distinguishes the people who've been able to maintain this marathon of social change efforts and still have some dignity and grace about them and not need a legal commitment? Well, here are the four. Centering rituals that we got to find every day to sit down and be quiet and think and meditate and pray and reflect and get back to why are we doing this? And what's the ultimate value of all this? And again, part of that centering ritual is this is all first founded on the primacy of personal recovery. Recovery advocacy is not a program of personal recovery. So whatever I'm doing out there in the world, I got to start here. Number two is this mirroring rituals. Doing this work alone can suck you dry, agreed? So we got to have people, until we get to see those benefits coming in communities and see the change beginning to unfold that feeds us, we got to have relationships with one another that can sustain us through that period. So we need things like we're doing today, agreed? To feed us. And then we can go back and do this for 4 or 5 or 6 months, and then we got to come back and get replenished. Acts of self-care, not only to take care of ourselves, but acts of self-care in terms of a little wider circle. And I'm really talking about our family and intimate relationships. One of the most profound things that anybody ever told me, I quoted in your outline. One must be careful in carrying light to the community to not leave one's own home in darkness. With me? That's some powerful, powerful words. Finally, unpaid acts of service. Many of us moved into some kind of paid role that sort of buys us some time to do some things in this movement. And yet when I find people who make it long term, and I say, what do you do away from work? And some of those people, they tell me insane stuff. Oh, I volunteer over here, and I go over there, and I do that for my church, and I coach. Like more service. It's like they're in codependent hell, right? And normally we would frame that as unbelievable pathology, right? So I'm looking at them like, well, It makes no sense. Given what you do in your job, why on earth would you be doing that stuff away from your job? And you know what they tell me? It reminds me of why I got into doing this stuff to begin with. And sometimes I forget that in my paid job from just all the crap I got to put up with. Unpaid acts of service. So no matter what we do in the name of the movement, we need to take a little time and go back there. And finally, one of the things I think it's time that we did as part of that is I think it's time we began to tell people, we want you to vote with your feet every September, right? And come out for these big recovery celebration events. We also want you to vote with your wallet. Some recovering people are incredibly tight. You know that? Cheap. I mean, I don't want to get into talking bad about people, right? But there ought to be. I like the idea of tithing to the movement. Okay. So I think it's time we begin to talk to some folks a little bit about money too, and reaching a point where we don't have to go begging that this movement for the recovery community is supported by the recovery community. I just need to tell you, I'm really looking forward to the continued discussions that are going to follow here in a couple of minutes. It's just been my incredible honor for these years to, in some ways, run around the country, listening to you, and writing what you do and what you're thinking, and getting far more credit than I deserve. And let me tell you, you have been my heroes, and you continue to be my heroes. God bless. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.